I wrote the entirety of the script during my spring break, and during that time I did a lot of self-reflection. How I need to start figuring out what to do with my life, the need to become productive again, how to deal with the fact that the world continually gets worse and worse until nothing can be salvaged and we will have to answer to the consequences of our actions eventually. I also watched the Timmy Powers a lot. Birthed from creative genius at Nickelodeon, and blessed upon us unworthy mortals not once but thrice over, between 2004 and 2006, the Timmy Power Hour trilogy is one of the greatest things that the network has ever done. In my opinion. You take two different Nicktoons with contrasting themes of science and magic respectively, and also drastically different animation comedy styles, and you get something that legitimately works. It's better than, say, those cringy crossover videos that somehow escape the confines of DeviantArt.
I would have defeated Thanos if you hadn't interfered.
But AJ...
I would have defeated Thanos if you hadn't interfered!
But that's also a low-setting bar, to be fair. I was obsessed with this trilogy when I was younger and would constantly watch them on my iPod Touch. Well, the first two anyways. I never got around to buying the third one from iTunes. But despite my clear bias towards the Fairly Odd Parents, since that was my hyperfixation at the time and I could only remember one standalone episode from Jimmy Neutron, I was able to enjoy what both shows were able to bring forth. And as of writing this, I've not only been able to see more episodes of Jimmy Neutron, but I actually remembered to achieve younger me's dream of owning all three on DVD. Needless to say,
I was overjoyed.
And now that I've seen these three multiple times during a short period of time, I feel confident enough to do a ranking video on them. I'm going into this assuming you've either seen the trilogy already or don't care about spoilers. This isn't going to be a blatant recap either, and if you want one, I suggest checking out the video on Jordan Fringe's channel. It's really good, really funny, and YouTube will not stop recommending it to me. I really need to work on my ending transitions.
Your life is everything. You serve all purpose.
You should kill yourself now.
Let me start this off by saying that this was my favorite as a kid for reasons I'll get into in a bit, but for now I need to justify why it's now the opposite. To be honest, I had a hard time deciding between this special and the one now ranked second on which is my least favorite of the trilogy, and I let it boil down to how I felt walking away from the respective episodes. And this one honestly had the least positive impact on me. It's by no means a bad special, and its themes on friendship are definitely good. Hell, it's something I've struggled with myself, and a bit of that lingers to this day. But the special feels the need to be so upfront about its message that it's insulting. Characters will straight up explain the world to the audience. I mean, each other, and oftentimes end up breaking the immersion for me because of how in your face it is. It honestly feels insulting, especially when there's plenty of instances of both shows being more subtle with their morals. Hell, even the other two aren't as transparent as this in that department. Another gripe of mine would have to be Jimmy and Tammy's treatment towards Shirley throughout the special. I mean, obviously there needs to be conflict and it's called the Jerkinators for a reason, but much of it boils down to the running gag of the two tricking Shirley into thinking they're either going to hang out with him or negotiate with him. As much as it fuels his personal motives for revenge, the joke gets really stale the more it gets used throughout the episode. I honestly feel more sympathy towards him than I did towards Jimmy or Timmy. We're both honestly assholes in this special in general. Again, part of the point, but pair this with the outright insulting presentation of the lesson it's trying to teach, and it can honestly get infuriating for me. I found it really weird that AJ and Chester didn't question how Timmy knew about and interacted with another dimension, nor did they question who Cosmo and Wanda were at any point. We know everyone in Jimmy's universe thinks they're computer programs, but Chester and AJ are from Timmy's universe. They know that he's not that competent, especially AJ. Or maybe he would, considering that unfunny gag of him thinking he was in the 24th century for most of the episode. My final complaint is something I'll also defend, which is the lack of time spent in Retroville this time around. I hear this as a negative whenever people talk about the special, and while I get it, I also think it's petty given what was going on behind the scenes. I may not be as well versed in Jimmy Neutron lore, but I'd rather have DNA Productions put more time and effort into working on the final episodes of Jimmy Neutron to please their own fans, rather than on a third special that uses two vastly different animation styles. Chester and Shirley definitely stick out like sore thumbs in the world of Retroville. I can't deny that either. The DNA Productions was shutting down at this time thanks to the Ant Bully flopping at the box office and being forced into bankruptcy as a result. Paul has been homeless since the mid-2000s. It's all thanks to you and your parents, you sick bat! So it's understandable that the short time and occasional low quality is here, and I'm okay with that. Moving on to the positives, Timmy looks the best he's ever been in a 3D environment. I think the little time spent in Jimmy's dimension is compensated with amazing animation and slightly better models for Timmy, Wanda, Cosmo, and AJ. I also really love the time spent in Shirley's homemade dimension. Retro Dims Daleville. The communication between the 2D and 3D animation studios must have been tight, considering how insane the combination of the Fairly OddParents art style on top of the 3D models looks. Kinda like Mr. Game & Watch, but less stiff. Retro Dims Daleville feels like a love letter to both shows. Granted, with a lesser budget than what they'd have wanted, it's still all the heart. It's a good compensation for something that isn't even an issue that I have with the episode. Hell, Shirley himself is a highlight for me. I think introducing an original villain who's the literal embodiment of the consequences for Jimmy and Timmy's actions is an interesting concept that, for the most part, was pulled off really well. I'm happy he got to open that pizzeria at the end, even if we never see him or it ever again. He honestly deserved it after everything he was subjected to. I also think that the comedy here is the best in the entire trilogy. Maybe it's because I've seen it the least of the three, but there's jokes that still make me laugh out loud and that I love quoting. Purely mistreatment aside, the majority of the jokes in this episode land, some better than others. It gives off the vibe of a chaotic, out-of-control compilation video that you get recommended on YouTube. They feel primed for something like that. I wonder if you can watch it somewhere on someone's channel. Lastly, as preachy as it got sometimes, I adore the chemistry between the characters in this special. Timmy and Jimmy feel better off to me personally as friends instead of rivals, and it's nice to see them get along for as much as they do this time around. Watching their respective parents interact briefly in Retro Dims Daleville is also really fun, and even more so when their friends have their standalone moments with each other. Call me a sucker for fan service, but honestly really warms my heart to see these interactions and integrations. Part of me feels bad for having this as my least favorite considering its positives. It's a distinct part of the trilogy for sure, but sometimes that makes it feel the least connected to the heart of the series itself. And what's the heart? I have no idea honestly, it's a je ne sais quoi. Overall, the Jerkinators isn't bad. Definitely flawed, but when it does something right, it does so amazingly. And luckily, it was able to help serve as a decent ending for Jimmy Neutron and the Fairly OddParents, which, as we all know, were both able to end peacefully after this. Not a bad way to go out, but definitely could have been better.
Think?
It's me, boy, on the PS5, speaking to you inside your brain!
The original Jimmy Timmy Power Hour is pretty damn iconic. I think that's an undeniable statement. It was the first of its kind and a major change to what Nickelodeon, or any network really, was putting out at the time. Crossovers were definitely not a new concept, but when you take two shows as different and distinct as Fairly OddParents and Jimmy Neutron but make them work near seamlessly, it really makes them stand out compared to other crossovers. But it's obviously not flawless, which I'll get out of the way now. Whenever people talk about this one in particular, they tend to criticize how Timmy's an asshole for the majority of the special, which, yeah, he kind of is. But they also tend to blatantly ignore how Jimmy is as well. He was okay with Fairy World becoming a straight-up dictatorship without worrying for its inhabitants. Look, I've only seen about 10 episodes of Jimmy Neutron, which makes me an expert, and I don't think that Jimmy would honestly go that far, especially considering how much Cosmo and Wanda helped him navigate through Dimsdale throughout the entire episode. Speaking of which, I do find it hard to believe that certain characters couldn't tell the difference between Timmy and Jimmy, especially Judy of all people. Even with the exploration of other planets and cartoony machines, the adventures of Jimmy Neutron is still more fairly grounded in reality than the Fairly OddParents is. Timmy's dad makes sense in thinking Jimmy is Timmy because he's literally the dumb dad trope, but Jimmy's mom is anything but. Hell, the fact that Cosmo could instantly recognize that Jimmy wasn't Timmy, but the near entirety of Dimsdale thought otherwise is a little infuriating to me. I mean, Timmy's obviously his godchild, so he could have known, but he's also an idiot by this point, and proud! There's also minor issues like with how Timmy has both a cartridge and a disc version of Decimator, which somehow wasn't crushed if a disc really was in the back pocket the whole time. And I'm honestly mixed on the fact that the titular duo barely interact. On the one hand, the special is a glorified role swap AU where they have to interact with each other's worlds and how much they handle problems within them. Not much of a Jimmy Timmy power hour if you ask me. Transitioning over to the positives though, I think the role swap does a really good job of bringing these two characters out of their elements and expanding upon them. Like I said before, one show is more grounded than the other, so it's really funny to me to see Jimmy try to rationalize elements like Wanda and Cosmo existing, and Timmy would totally mess around with Jimmy's inventions. He's Timmy! There's a lot of iconic moments here compared to the other two, namely the ending scene with Timmy and Jimmy shaking hands as they swap dimensions. It honestly felt weird to me seeing them go back to their normal selves after watching their swap versions for a while. This and the iconic opening for each special with the Battle of the Boomboxes definitely took a lot of communication between the animation departments, like I said previously. But unlike Jerkinators, this was among, if not the first medium blending of its kind. And for freaking television in 2004, man, you gotta admit, that's impressive as hell. Speaking of which, I don't think the swap designs are that bad for the main duo. Timmy definitely looks worse here, but at least he improved over time over the trilogy. and I honestly don't consider him to be the worst Fairly OddParents character in the Jimmy Neutron style. Oh my god, Chester, what did they do to you? The specials didn't have much continuity with either series, but this one brought the big one into Fairly OddParents canon, and the special itself carried over into Nicktoons Unite, which is still really neat. I love it. I thought that Hugh Neutron was as entertaining as ever, especially when he thinks Judy's roleplaying with him. I kinda didn't even pick up until my most recent binge viewing. Yeah, I'm real smart, I know. And now he's in All-Stars Brawl, baby! I honestly feel like every character in general had at least one good moment or overall characterization here. Even weaker ones like Mrs. Neutron and Timmy's classmates like Francis or AJ. But there's one I really want to talk about here, Mr. Crocker. I'm not even gonna deny at this point that I'm incredibly biased towards the Fairly OddParents in terms of the two shows in this trilogy, but I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an elitist either. I honestly was fine with the show during its modern seasons until its final one, not to mention the godforsaken live-action reboot. However much they're paying Suzanne and Darren for this isn't enough. But something that the post-hiatus show did for Crocker in particular was gradually reduce him to a one-note caricature who's obsessed with fairies and dunking on his mother. Compared to previous episodes of the Fairly OddParents, Crocker is definitely more embellished here than he was in those. However, I feel that this embellishment is enough to both make Crocker entertaining and fall in line with his established character. Crocker in the earlier seasons was mad, but he was also sleazy, conniving, and was subtle as he could be. Even with the exaggerated traits here, Crocker is still a legitimate threat. The dude was really willing to kill a child who wasn't even from his dimension in order to get his way. Something the new Crocker could never do because he's not Crocker. He is, again, a caricature. But yada yada yada, I miss the old Fairly OddParents, I thought the fight scene in this special is really good, moving on. TLDR, I really like this special. It deserves the legacy it has within the Nickelodeon pantheon and was a good way to start off the trilogy. But since this is a ranking out of 3, you probably already guessed what my number 1 was by the time we got to this one.
Tomorrow will never come!
Yeah, you heard me. I mean, you already knew at this point, but you heard me. Usually whenever people talk about their favorite Power Hours, it's either that this is the absolute best or the absolute worst of the trilogy. And I'm gonna be honest here, I have no idea why people don't like it, but I'll go over some common points of criticism. There is a bias towards the Fairly OddParents. Like I said in Jerkinators, the decreased screen time in Retroville is thanks to the massive box office bombing at the Ant Bully. CG animation is expensive, especially when compared to something like the Fairly OddParents. Again, I'd rather there be more Jimmy Neutron episodes than Power Hours. And it's not like crossover stories cannot be told with these two series just because one option is significantly cheaper than the other. And even without money in mind, the Fairly OddParents was at its peak popularity around this time. Nickelodeon is a corporation at the end of the day, so it makes sense that they would want to capitalize on a show that's not only incredibly more popular than the other, but that they would also want follow-ups to the ratings juggernaut the original was. It's definitely a justifiable reason for someone to criticize the end results of this decision, but even then, when Nerds Collide had more screen time in Retroville than Jerkinators. Really, by having the bias, you're killing two birds with one stone by milking one series and salvaging the other. It's too reliant on the first special. I was going to put the plot revolving around Cindy as its own separate category, but my defense is essentially the same as here. Sequels have the right to have both callbacks and continuations of those before it. The Jerkinators didn't do much of either, and thus feel somewhat disconnected from the other two. Cindy and Timmy are established to have mutual feelings towards each other in the first one, and the rivalry she has with Jimmy developed after the special. Hell, there's a future in the Tomorrow Boys where they're canonically married. I'm pretty sure that, at the very least, Jimmy's crush is reluctant but understandable. Besides the fact that they're both crushing on the same girl, Timmy's responsible for screwing things up in the first episode. It's natural that Jimmy wouldn't want him to worsen things, especially with someone like Cindy. Even with the chill ending from last time, there's grounds for a rivalry here, and I believe it. Plus, they're kids, man. I'm sure most of us had crushes at that time and handled it one way or another. Also, some jokes carry over from the first special, which I think is really neat, so kudos on that. I should also mention, too, at this point, the way the Jerkinator starts is with Timmy going like, alright, I'll just go see Cindy without any prompting at all. This part is not scripted, I'm just rambling. It just feels so random, comes out of absolutely nowhere. Meanwhile, with the previous special, as in, you know, when Nerds Collide, this was built up by the concept of the dance, which has a payoff at the end, and yeah, I'm sorry, it just, that's another problem I had with the Jerkinators. The swap designs aren't that good. I agree and disagree with this point. Personally, the worst offender here is Jorgen, regardless of whether he's fused or not. Cosmo and Wanda are a little uncanny, Timmy looks slightly improved. Maybe because they knew by this point how to animate him better, but not as good as in Jerkinators. As for the Jimmy Neutron characters, I think they look great in Dimsdale. I don't care why minor aspects were changed, like with Cindy's eyes changing color, and I think the weakest transition to 2D would be Carl for reasons I cannot find the words to explain. I still think that these designs are more charming than they are bad though. Except for Jorgen. If Chester didn't step through that portal in the third one, Jorgen would be my sleep paralysis demon, or Cindy in her goldfish form. I know it's repurposed from Raise the Uzi scab and was for a one-off character, but it looked ugly then and it looks worse here somehow. There's no Hugh Neutron. That's not a common complaint, that's just my complaint. Where is the best Jimmy Neutron character? And don't say it's, oh, he's in Carbonation. No! Where is he? The villains don't work. This is the part I probably disagree with the most, but first, I'll give you some context. The Power Hours never used the same villains twice, but I feel that it doesn't necessarily embrace the two shows' rogues galleries that well either. Power Hour OG had a well-written Crocker paired with the Decimator, who's actually a corrupted Goddard. Power Hour 3 had Eustace and the villains from the Crimson Shin comics, who I forgot were even in the special, if I'm gonna be honest, and Shirley, a villain who's entirely original to the special. The villains don't interact with each other unless the Megachins Discord server counts. Then you have Power Hour 2, which I feel made a very odd, but also smart decision that I will continue to defend until I die. So obviously they already used the big bad of the Fairly Odd Parents with Mr. Crocker for the first special. Naturally the follow-up would use Calamitous as this big bad. Now, stay with me here. Calamitous is notorious for never finishing anything and for being consistently foiled by Jimmy. You could say that compared to every other antagonist in the franchise, he's the most unlucky. Now we go to the Fairly Odd Parents side of things, which happens to have an entire race that thrives on bad luck to the point of celebrating Friday the 13th as a sacred holiday. Up until this point, anti-fairies were featured as a one-off threat in that old black magic, and would only appear again as an allyship / MacGuffin in the Gland Plan, which ends with Anti-Cosmo, leader of the Anti-Fairies, escaping prison and seeking to free the rest of his people, which Power Hour 2 continues on with. After finding a loophole in the rules, Anti-Cosmo makes his way to the Earth to find a pond to help him breach through security in Fairy World's prison. Now riddle me this. With someone as unlucky and desperate as Calamitous around, literally who better to play off him like this? It's both giving us the only times that the villains actually work off each other directly in these specials, and they're able to develop each other amazingly. Calamitous is able to get access to fairies thanks to his greed, but is temporarily imprisoned because A, blinded by said greed, and B, he's working with a villain! Of course he'd betray him! And even when Calamitous and Jorgen are freed, the greed doesn't go away, as the scientist goes power mad once he and Jorgen refuse and begin wreaking havoc. He actively tries to destroy the rules and is, like Crocker, willing to straight up murder children in order to achieve his reign of terror. Anti-Cosmo, meanwhile, is able to free the Anti-Fairies and temporarily succeeds in halting their rotation, as well as preventing Cosmo Wanda from wishing them away. He goes out of his way to taunt the protagonist because he fully believes he's unstoppable and gloats at the failures that brought them there. And it's true, Anti-Cosmo really gaslit gatekeeped an anti-girl boss's way to success. Similar to Calamitous, he and literally every other Anti-Fairy are so blinded by their own greed regarding bad luck that they're ultimately foiled by it, thanks to Timmy, Jimmy, and the gang. But even if their plan of it permanently being Friday the 13th around the world sounds stupid at a glance, really think of the ramifications here. If it were the same day, all day, every day, in the presence of anti-fairies is enough to prevent wishes from fairy godparents to be granted, then eventually plants would stop growing, resources would run scarce, animals would die out, and ultimately the human race, because time never changes, would die out. The weather never changes. Everything is set on a basis that cannot be met. It suffers from it as a result. Earth would become a desolate planet. The worst bad luck of all. But I'm overthinking an animated kids special from 2006 here. What I'm trying to say is that I like that the villains of the special parallel the internal conflicts of Timmy and Jimmy with their shared interest in Cindy. By letting their goals get to their heads, they ultimately end up becoming easily undone, which nearly happens when Jorgen non-consensually blasts Timmy and Jimmy in Dimsdale, as the two are fighting over who saves Cindy from said blast. Plus, Calamitous and Anti-Cosmo feel like direct consequences of the protagonist's selfish neglect of their surroundings rather than being fodder. Not to say that the other villains in the series are bad, but I feel that Power Hour 2 was the best in that department, because, you know, I was literally screaming over it. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but no, I do not have a crush on any of the villains from this trilogy. It sounds out of left field for some people, but I literally spent a good chunk of 2021 being open about finding Dr. Engine from the Crash Bandicoot series romantically attractive, and if he thinks he's attractive in any way, then really anything is possible at this point. I do, however, have an overall critique of the trilogy now that I'm at this point. So the Kickstarter of this whole trilogy is that Timmy wishes he was in the greatest science lab in the universe, a very plot-heavy sentence that carries out the rest of the special and the trilogy as a whole. But in the sequel, Anti-Cosmo relies on the fact that there are other universes, which Calamitous confirms he is from. Again, another plot-heavy sentence since it kickstarts the external conflict. Which one is it, guys? Is it the same universe or two separate ones? I know I just spent some time defending Power Hours 2's antagonist, but still. And then the third one, Jimmy refers to Dimsdale as a neighboring dimension? I guess as their final explanation for the two, but then that brings the prior two plot points into question, since the third one doesn't rely on a line like that. Regardless of what you want to call the relationship between Retroville and Dimsdale though, you gotta admit that the special's most iconic moment is the conjoined school dance. The constant switching from 2D to 3D looks absolutely amazing, especially with Cindy. Plus you have that equally iconic moment of Carl holding Calamitous within a jar and having him turn into Mrs. Neutron. Fun fact, this is technically Calamitous' final appearance in the Jimmy Neutron series, and he gets the proper Rainbow Dash send-off. And the special ends with everyone dancing to My Shiny Teeth and Me, literally one of the best songs to come from a Nichitoon period. How the hell can you not love this moment as a standalone scene? It's amazing. And the special is from? Easily my favorite entry of the Jimmy to Me Power Hour trilogy. Hey guys, Future Midnight here. Remember that part I said earlier that I didn't find any of the villains each attractive? You see, it's kind of a funny story actually. I shouldn't wait until the next spring break to contemplate my actions.